All right, Melissa, I guess, Walter, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, Melissa, you want to hit the,
You're
give us
good.
the word? Okay.
We're live.
Okay. Well, I think if we're ready on the technical side, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Walter Alcorn, chair of the NVTC WMATA Committee. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to our September 29th NVTC WMATA Committee meeting. I'd like to note that we are starting the meeting at 6:09 p.m. So today's meeting, it's an all virtual public meeting as permitted under Virginia's Freedom of Information Act and under NVTC's electronic participation policy. So the meeting's being streamed live via NVTC's YouTube account. And if your live stream transmission fails, we would ask anyone watching to email this address, support@novatransit.org. So NVTC staff are monitoring this account throughout the meeting. So it's been some time since we've had an all virtual meeting. So I'd like to remind everyone to mute themselves if you're not speaking and to use the raised hand function after a presentation for questions. Although with the attendance today, I don't think we'll have too much of a problem for people chiming in over each other. I would now ask Andrew DeVetter, NVTC's WMATA Program Manager, to call the roll to identify commissioners and NVTC staff currently present on the call.
All right, thank you, Chairman Alcorn. Please respond here when you hear your name. Mr. Alcorn.
Here.
Mr. Aguirre.
Present.
Mr. DeFerranti.
Here.
And Mr. Snyder.
Here.
As a reminder, NVTC bylaws state that committee meetings are open for any commissioners to attend. I do not see any other commissioners, although we are expecting a few more commissioners to join a little later on. So we do have a quorum. I will like to now identify staff and include their titles for the benefit of the listening public. Executive Director Kate Mattice, Director of Programs and Policy Alan Fye. I'm WMATA Program Manager Andrew Better. We have Program Analyst Ramada Zach Williams, IT Web Services Manager Melissa Walker. And from WMATA, we have Greg Potts, Allison Davis, and Peter Cafiero, who the chairman will introduce shortly as we get to their agenda item. I will turn it back to the chair.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. DeVetter. Let's then go to our first item on the agenda. That's the July 21st NVTC WMATA Committee meeting summary. So I would just ask if any committee members have any changes to the summary. Okay. Hearing no changes, those will stand. Then let's go on to item number 3, which is WMATA presentation on the Bus Network Redesign. So as I think many of you are aware, WMATA's kicked off the Bus Network Redesign, which aims to redesign Metrobus, Fairfax City Q, and Prince George's The Bus to be more customer-friendly and efficient. This effort's been a long time coming, and I'm excited to have WMATA staff here this evening to brief the committee on the first phase of elected official outreach. So I'd like to introduce Allison Davis, who's Vice President of Planning at WMATA, and Peter Cafiero, Managing Director of Intermodal Planning at WMATA. So Allison and Peter, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. So good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. Thank you for having us, and I'll give a shout out to Andrew who invited us to attend tonight. So this is our first presentation to you on the Better Bus brand and the network redesign. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll just provide you an update on this. This is similar to what we took to our board last week and have been and are continuing to engage DOT directors and elected officials across the region on this as well. So next slide, please. The bus network redesign, it harks back to both the LaHood report from 2017, but also the bus transformation project that NVTC passed or endorsed in March of 2020. just before the pandemic. So, what that was is really put together the vision, the recommendations, and the action plan to make bus the mode of choice on the region's roads into the future. And so one of the major recommendations was this network redesign. Another recommendation that's also included in this effort is looking at the subsidy allocation and the funding formula. So if you want to go to the next slide. We always like to take this opportunity to really highlight the bus customer demographics, right? It is so important to think about who is riding the bus. And we saw this, we've known this from before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, it was just further highlighted how essential bus was to the functioning of the region. And so really just highlighting that bus customers are 4 times, 5 times as likely to live in a zero car household as those in the region, right? They're 10 times as likely to be low income. They are more, about 50% more likely to be persons of color. So it's, again, really highlighting some of the most vulnerable residents of our region are our bus customers. And so just making sure we're confident in knowing who is really on board. If you want to go to the next slide, please. This is information that we've known for a while as part of the bus transformation project. We obviously went out and surveyed lots of customers and potential customers, right? It wasn't always just customers. It was people across the region and across all areas of the region, whether in Virginia, Maryland, or the district, regardless of demographic, income, regardless of how often they rode. The top 3 priorities were frequency, reliability, and directness of service or connectivity, right? And so we've seen this even like during the surveys we've done during the pandemic. And so again, it's really highlighting what customers want to see in terms of bus service. Next slide. So going back to what was in bus transformation, because obviously there was a lot of engagement, there was a lot of effort that went into that. Some of the work that we've been able to accomplish during the pandemic were, we passed, the Metro Board passed the Metro Bus Service Guidelines that really sets forth how we think about designing service and measuring performance. Thanks to you and many of your peers, we were able to get the full transfer discount adopted into the FY23 budget. So that means people can transfer between bus and rail and get that $2 discount. And then we've also been able to staff up a bus priority program, and we're actively working with some of the Virginia jurisdictions as well as DC and Maryland to move forward on a lot of the needs to prioritize bus. So those really underpin the work that we're going to do as part of the network redesign. And then there's obviously concurrent work in zero emission vehicles, expanding bus priority, marketing bus service, those things that part of that will feed into the network redesign. It also then helps bolster the work going forward. Next slide, please. Turn it over to Peter for this.
Peter, I think you're muted.
I was just writing Allison. It's been a while since I've used Zoom because we do a lot in Teams, so forgot where that was. But yes, so thank you, board members and board chair, and for inviting us to talk to you today. There are a number of aspects of bus network redesigns. You've probably, I'm sure, seen how Alexandria did theirs. So familiar with them in general, trying to see if needs have changed over time. But a couple of things I wanted to highlight that we clearly want to look at are bus priority infrastructure. We want to make sure we're making the most use of infrastructure that our jurisdictions have already provided, bus lanes and traffic priority and things like that. And identify areas where we might need to expand that and try to get the buses faster and more reliably through the street network. And strengthening our frequent service network, which has already yielded benefits as we came back from pandemic and really emphasized some of our major corridors being on a regular 7-day-a-week frequency. Some of those routes are now carrying actually more than pre-COVID. So I want to try to maximize that. We realize, though, that this also has to be balanced with a long-term, sustainable, predictable, understandable funding model and cost allocation formula. We know there's a lot of complaints and challenges with the current funding formula. And so that's part of this study, has to really look at ways that we can improve that. Slide, please. So the products that we anticipate to get out of this, intend to get out of this, fall in sort of two buckets. There's the service and network side of the network redesign. And the primary product there is really going to be aimed for informing our fiscal year 2025 budget process, which is only about 13, 14 months from now. So our goal is to get a recommended network for Metrobus changes and funding allocation recommendations into that process, into the board process in December of calendar 23, and then public hearings over the winter and early 24, to then begin rolling out changes during fiscal 25. There will be some recommendations that, for various resource reasons, won't be able to happen in FY25. So this will outline essentially a roadmap for future years beyond that. There may be some near-term service improvements that are just no-brainers to proceed with, not wait for FY24, and we certainly will take those opportunities as they come up. The second area is the higher level policy parts of things. I mentioned the funding model, but also the role of Metrobus in each jurisdiction. We know it's different across the region, but if there are ways that we could make sure we all come to a consensus and understanding of what the role really is within each of these regions, each of these jurisdictions, that's something we're going to try to work towards in this study. Next. We view this as really a 5-step process. The first step we've already completed is Allison noted the project that she led, the bus transformation project, really is the basis, the foundation of what we're doing here, and a lot of other recommendations for that from that process are moving forward in parallel. We are currently in what we're calling step 2 here, beginning public outreach in the next couple of weeks, outreach to you and to others in the region that's already underway, to confirm our guiding principles of the study. What are our goals? What are we trying to get out of this? What are our priorities as a region and as individual jurisdictions? And identifying, using data as well as input from everyone we're talking to, identifying needs, opportunities, gaps in services with the existing network, things that we need to try to correct. Then we'll take the time over the winter to turn all that information into 2 proposed networks that will show perhaps different ways of looking at the problem, so we can get some feedback on alternatives. We will bring that out in the public in next spring, as well as our discussions on the role of Metrobus. Take all that information over the summer and come back in fall of next year with recommendations, as I mentioned, for a recommended network for FY25. At all stages of the project, we're going to make sure that we're including focus on equities, but we obviously at the end have to do the analysis required as well. And all that will then get wrapped into the December plan, and of course there'll be another opportunity to revise it. So we'll bring it out in the fall, take comments, probably make revisions, submit it to our board in December, and then there'll be a public hearing process for a final approval in March of 24. And then the 5th step, big major amount of work involved, don't want to minimize it, is actually implementing all of this. A lot of factors we have to consider as we get closer to that. Next. Throughout the region, Allison and I talked to all the jurisdictions probably about more than a year ago at this point, as we were scoping out the study to offer different alternatives for how each of, how the jurisdictions could involve themselves. Two of them, Prince George's County in Maryland and the city of Fairfax, opted to go all in with us and have this study look at their bus networks, Q and the bus, as well as the metro in their jurisdictions. Montgomery County currently, similar to City of Alexandria a couple years ago, is doing their own network redesign. So again, similar to our participation in Alexandria, we're going to participate in Montgomery and coordinate that with the other work that we're doing, the other counties and cities. For the district, Arlington and Fairfax County, we will be working, presuming that the current circulator ART and Fairfax connector routes are essentially fixed, and we are looking at the Metro Bus network, but we'll still be working very closely with all of those jurisdictions as well. And the city of Alexandria, as I mentioned, we participated in a network redesign. We don't anticipate reopening that process, but we will work with the city of Alexandria looking at how Metro Bus into Alexandria interfaces with the other jurisdictions outside. Next. Back to you, Allison.
All right, so I think as I'm sure you're not surprised by, this is as much an outreach conversation discussion with partners like yourselves, with customers out in the region, with our bus drivers, with actually other Wamata staff. So that is as much about that as it is the actual technical work of redesigning the network. So we are out right now meeting with all of the different audiences that you're seeing. So we have jurisdictional staff from all of your jurisdictions as well as MVTC on the technical committee, and that's the one that's getting really down into the details of or at least will be down into the details of how we're redesigning that network. We've got a community connections committee that's really looking to bring advocates, the business community, different community-based organizations together to help us really guide the work we're doing. And then of course, reaching out to elected officials, union, frontline staff. So all of that is underway, and we will be touching each of these groups throughout the course of this project. So it's not just a one-time only conversation. Next slide, please. So as Peter mentioned, we are heading out. The public / customer engagement starts next week. The survey should be live by the end of next week, and then pop-ups will start immediately following. So we'll be out across Virginia as well as DC and Maryland, holding 15 pop-ups. We've got about 9 different bus stop chats where we have a more detailed conversation with customers. So to really kind of hear from them, and then obviously we'll have the survey that we're getting them to, we're asking people to fill out, but also going through social media and the variety of different ways that we can spread the word and get insight. So all of this is really happening in October into November for this first round. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to make sure we had discussed with you is our board last week adopted these guiding principles. And it really goes to, these principles will help guide not just our approach, but how we make decisions, right? And so just highlighting a couple of them that we're building that network that is customer focused, that is from a regional perspective, right? So hearing from you as the regional leaders, hearing from our customers, what are the needs? What are the places we need to connect? Back to the priorities, fast, frequent, reliable, fewer transfers, if that's where the input goes, like that will help really form a lot of the basis for the network redesign. And then it's using the service guidelines and the data that we have both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, right now, 22, that information to really help guide the approach that we're taking and the decisions we're making, and then really grounding this in a level of cost effectiveness, making sure it's data driven that we're making these business decisions. So highlighting a lot of that for you, and then also making sure that we are starting with equity, given who we know is riding the bus, like making sure that equity is built from the beginning, not just a question at the end. Next slide, which I believe is our last. All right, so next steps, outreach and engagement. Obviously, we are, as I said, we're out starting in October, and we're briefing elected officials, community partners, and that sort of those types of audiences. We're finalizing the goals, objectives, and metrics. So this will get us through the end of the calendar year. And then we have recently published our annual line performance report that takes every bus line that we operated in FY 19, 20, and 21 and puts those up against the service guidelines and the performance metrics. So those are all online at wamata.com. And then we'll also have that assessment of the market assessment, the demand assessment, understanding where we're competitive, where there are gaps, all of that about the current network. So that is all happening as we speak. And we will be wrapping up the Planning Foundation findings the end of this calendar year. So with that,
Allison, if I could just,
yes.
I apologize. I realized just after I handed it over to you, when I was going through jurisdictions, I probably did a cardinal sin in Virginia. I omitted the City of Falls Church. We are talking to them. We'll talk to them, and clearly Metrobus is a major transit provider there, so they're part of the study as well. And just want to make sure. I think I got all of them now.
That's a very good recovery, Peter. Nice
We
job.
feel well cared for. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Allison, Peter. Appreciate that very much. The committee has had a good amount of discussion about the disconnect between Metrobus service and subsidy that our jurisdictions pay through NVTC. So one of the things that we've been talking about is updating the Metrobus formula and the way we pay for Metrobus. And tying that back, recreating the nexus back to the service a jurisdiction reaches. So that's something, just FYI, that's on our radar. And I do have a question, Allison, back on slide 6, I believe it was. Just curious, actually, I guess it wasn't 6. Go ahead. It's the results of the survey. Here we go. One more. So it must be 8. Yeah, there we go. That's it. 8. So I'm curious, I think I heard you say that these responses were pretty consistent across the region. Is that correct? And I'm particularly interested in, frankly, affordable fares scored pretty low, lower than some of us might think otherwise. But was that pretty consistent across the region?
So it was. So yes. So this was consistent across the region, and the top 3 were consistent across income group.
Okay, across income groups. Yeah.
Yes. So that said, the people who we always ask demographic questions in right. So respondents who said that they were on or who indicated they were on the lower income spectrum did prioritize affordable fares higher than longer hours, right? Like so this is over all the respondents, this was the priority. But if you look just at the respondents who said they were low income, they had the first 3 the same, and then they had affordability up a little bit higher.
Okay.
But it goes to show that service trumps fares in terms of how people think about what they want from their transit service.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Allison. Appreciate that thorough response. Let me open it up at this point to any questions from other committee members or comments. And we've got a small group, so if you want to raise your hand electronically, that's okay, or you could just unmute.
I really
Mr. DeFerrante, yes.
Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the presentation. I like this slide that we're on. I also, the preceding slide, I think quite a bit of the knowledge that you, Walter, and you, Dave, have in particular, and I know, I think I probably am less grounded transparently in the data than you have been, but it is such a stark slide for me. And, my experience, is the 23, the 38, and the 42 buses. One's in DC, the other two are in Virginia. And with those, it just really resonates the reliability of service. And so mostly it's a comment, but it's also to reliability of service, it can be day or week defining to have a bus break down. And so that is high in my mind. And I don't know, there's a long-term move to electric buses, and picturing the 23 through Northern Virginia. And is there anything you can say to the reliability of buses in terms of maintenance issues during routes now versus sort of 10 years ago? And I know there's a big some hesitation on electric buses due to the reliability. So I don't know if that's which one of that's for Allison or Peter, but I just thought I'd share those two thoughts. One, that this is just so important and key to equity and key to what we ought to be doing. And second, did you have any thoughts on reliability? Because it was one of those top four in the next slide.
You want to start, Allison?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the reliability that survey question was getting to was actually reliability of travel time, right? So there obviously, to your point, there is a reliability of the bus itself, but it's also the question of, is the bus going to show up, whether it was for maintenance or just other issues, and then how long is it going to take me to get to work, right? Like, or wherever I'm going. So is it going to reliably take me 20 minutes? And I know, plus or minus a minute or two, not that big a deal, but am I having to estimate 45 minutes? Because sometimes it takes me 20 and other times it takes me 45 and I need to be there on time. So I'm going to 45. So that's the reliability there. I will say I'll pause and see if Peter has anything he wants to add for.
No, so first of all, agree with what Allison said, agree with what you said, that reliability, actually, if you're thinking about the customer, they don't really care who's running the bus. They don't really care, at least in terms of their transportation, how the bus is fueled, or all those, whether it's the bus breaks down or the bus gets stuck in traffic or the bus never shows. Those are all unreliable situations, right? So we want to try to address as many of those as we can. I will say that, I've personally talked to many people who have been doing network redesigns, as well as, because we all are dealing with the transition to zero emission buses, primarily at this point, battery electric buses. I think the general philosophy nationally and the philosophy that we clearly have in this study is, let's start first with what do our customers and our non-customers, what do the residents of the region need in terms of transportation? And then figure out how we match up the technology and the other aspects to get there. The feeling is that with the battery buses, their range will improve over time. There'll be, but over the time, of course, of them being integrated into any of our systems, so there will be, abilities to make that work. Certainly, very long routes, regardless of propulsion, very long routes can become very unreliable. Routes that are too short might not be economical and provide the right service. So these are all things that we will take into account as we're looking at this.
Great. And I don't know if that sort of really helps me. And I don't know, Allison, if you were going to follow up, but I also want to be mindful of there's a good chunk for me to learn and engage on. And so that's very helpful as I think about the, traffic being a key factor in reliability. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. De Ferranti. Excellent questions. On the electric bus electrification, I do want to give a shout out to the city of Alexandria. Mr. Aguirre, you guys, thank you for being the big guinea pigs on that.
Woo!
In the region. You're figuring it out for us. Thank you. So, other questions, comments from committee members? Okay, well, hearing none, thank you very much. Both of you, excellent slides, great data. Appreciate your thoroughness, and we look forward to continued engagement as this project moves forward.
Thank you. We do too.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, then let's move up. Next on the agenda, we have the 2022 update on the annual report on the performance and condition of Wamata. So this is, as we all know, I believe by now, required by state code. NVTC is responsible for the annual submission to the Governor and General Assembly of a report on the performance and conditions of Wamata. So this will be the 5th annual report. Wow, time flies. Produced by NVTC, and this presentation from staff is to give us a brief update on their progress before we see a draft of key chapters at our next meeting in October. And Andrew, I believe this one's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Renetta. Well, since we last met with the committee in July, we've basically been hard at work writing. The structure of this year's report is similar to past years. I do want to highlight a few areas of key committee interest and feedback. The first is that with our audience being the Governor and General Assembly, we have really gotten hard to work on an introduction chapter. It's different from previous years that sets the framework for WMATA's short and long-term operating funding gaps. That was a key area of interest. And so just setting the stage with the gradual recovery from the pandemic, laying out some of the structural challenges that we'll talk about shortly, and that were presented to the WMATA board last week. We also look forward, once there are announcements, to highlighting some of the new stations that will be online with the Silver Line Phase 2 in Potomac Yard, as it's a good way to showcase those kind of investments in the report. As we previously discussed, the strategy chapter is meant to be it is the legislative requirement to recommend strategies to reduce growth and costs and improve operational efficiency, but it's also a policy platform for the commission to state its priorities about Metro. And so we've really streamlined that chapter, and we'll talk about the way those 7 recommendations that we've talked about have evolved shortly. As we've continued to work on the report, we've chosen to embed recent accomplishments by WMATA into those relevant chapters just to help keep things streamlined. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start going through the 7. These are the same as what you've seen before, but the words have changed a little bit as we've really gotten writing. What you're seeing at the top are what the top line strategies are going to be in the draft that you'll see in several weeks. And then the bullets are sort of each sort of subheader for those, and we'll have additional text in the draft that we are currently working on. So the first strategy here, the first 5 are directed at WMATA, and the last 2 are directed at BTC. I'm going to go over these at a high level, so happy to take questions, but this is meant to be a high level update as we have been evolving these over the last few months. So the first strategy is to rebuild customer confidence with returning the 7000 series trains to service, improving the safety and management culture, improving the physical safety and security of customers. The second is to enforce fair payment uniformly across the system. And the core of this strategy is really that everyone should pay their fares, and that we do need some enforcement. This strategy is primarily framed around public safety and security and the welfare of transit operators who've experienced an increase in assaults. We've also included a recommendation here that for jurisdictionally sponsored and funded long-term fare products are an available mechanism here as well. The third strategy is to implement, thank you, Ramada. The third strategy is to implement a simple and convenient fare structure. And this includes exploring concepts like the flat or zone fare, recognize some revenue trade-offs that need to be considered given budget parameters. But it also calls for simplifying not just the structure, but the customer experience to make sure it's easy to pay for your fare and easy to manage your benefits passes or other such products. And lastly, it calls for integrating local and regional transit providers into Wamata's fare structure. Fare payment systems has been a key priority of the Commission over the last 4 or 5 years. The fourth strategy is to increase non-fare revenues from real estate and advertising. And the fifth is to manage labor costs, focusing on prior Commission recommendations regarding seeking amendments to the Wolf Act. Go to the next slide. This is where we switch to recommendations for NBTC, which is a new approach. In this case, this recommendation is to explore the implications of local transit agencies assuming the operation of Metro bus services in Northern Virginia. We would do this by identifying the opportunities and challenges of such an endeavor, evaluating the policy, the funding, state, federal, and local, capital, facility, governance, labor, and other types of policy considerations. This would be coordinated with our other ongoing studies, as well as would have extensive staff, both jurisdictional and Wamata coordination and feedback, as well as touch points for the Commission. We envision this being done through a white paper, consultant produced. The product may recommend additional areas for study, but it would not make a recommendation about whether we should go in this direction or not. It's meant to be information and a policy exercise, not a service exercise. The results of such an endeavor would help our jurisdictions and the Commission chart a course on the role of Metrobus and local transit operators in Northern Virginia. And that role of Metrobus was something that Allison Davis spoke about, would be part of the Bus Network Redesign effort in her previous slides. And we go to the next slide, please. The last recommendation here is for NBTC to examine and develop options for a new financial operating model for Wamata. Throughout the last 6 months, we've heard very loudly and clearly from committee members that Wamata's old financial model is no more and that we need a new one. And Wamata's operating budget outlook is stark with a smaller short-term budget gap in 24 that's buoyed by remaining federal aid. And then at the aid is exhausted and the structural operating gap is upon us rather quickly in fiscal 25, which we'll talk about in the next agenda item. Developing options here would be done through a working group, which would evaluate and explore those gaps with a perspective on Virginia's unique jurisdictional funding and nodal relationships with Wamata. It would examine existing and potentially new operating revenues, look at opportunities to reform Wamata and state level laws and policies around Wamata budget and subsidy. And this could include the legislative 3% operating cap, Wamata's implementation of said cap, CTB policy, Wamata board policy, and especially linking back to the previous presentation, Wamata board policy around how to pay for bus. We envision that this working group would be comprised of key jurisdictional and DRPT staff and would have strategic touch points with the committee and commission. Developing options here is the key phrase in this recommendation, because we see these results plugging in, results from the working group plugging in the appropriate places as conversations happen at a regional level, happen at a Wamata board level. We don't really know that outcome yet, so I think it's important to be flexible. But in a broad level sense, this is a way for us to start having conversations that are similar to what the Wamata general manager has spoken about, which is, as a region, we do need to decide what kind of transit system we want and then start to talk about how to pay for it. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a timeline of most of the things that I've talked about. So it creates a very busy year and a half, but it's an important time. So just high level here on this timeline to help set the stage. We have the Wamata budget processes. Fiscal 24 is about to start. The bus network redesign is just starting and will plug into both the 24 and then more importantly, it will plug into the fiscal 25 process with a recommended network in December of calendar 23. And then we have a number of studies ongoing, some of which have started, some of which we're talking about in this process to start next calendar year, which would have coordination and then obviously some touch points with the commission and the committee, and then we'll see where they go after that. So at this point, I'm going to jump to the next steps. We can go to the next slide. The next steps here for the annual report are that we will keep writing. And at the October 20 committee meeting, we'll have a draft of the intro, dedicated capital funding strategies chapters for the committee to review. We'll have an information item as a work session at the November commission meeting, and then action in December, and we'll send the report by the deadline. So that is our path forward. And I think at this point, I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Excellent presentation. I just have one question or maybe suggestion around proposed strategy number 7. If you could go back to that slide. So the last bullet, it says reform Wamata and state level laws or policies. Could we also take a look at federal laws and policies as well as part of this? Would that be possible? Certainly the federal government, not directly, but indirectly, is a very significant player in operating revenues currently for Wamata. So that is a suggestion if possible.
Absolutely. I assume that you are thinking about the way that transit benefits for federal employees and others play indirectly into the operating budget.
Yes.
We, I think we can certainly add that in. It is intended to be referenced in some of the fair policy conversations. But it's relevant in multiple places, as many are in this report.
I think that'd be great to have them as part of this. Okay, great. All right, thank you, Andrew. Let me open it up for any committee member questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I hope
Mr.
it's
DeFront.
okay. I hope I didn't jump the line with Dave or others, but this is, it seems excellent to me. I think each time I've kind of thought about this report and said, oh, we do this every year. But each year I feel like it's really tailored, and just a big thank you, Andrew, for the work, as well as the whole team who works on it. 2 slides before this, maybe, or 1 slide before this. It's number 6. So the next slide, sorry. I think this is great. The substance works here. The first bullet, depending on how you're presenting or where we're presenting this, I think that substantively that's right. It just seems as though it's a close to restatement of this is the first sub bullet, seems almost a restatement of the first bullet, if that makes sense. Examine the challenges and opportunities. And so, not trying to nitpick, but you may want to, if you're presenting this, we just send the full report to Richmond, so this may not be a big deal, but you may want to give us a little more sense of what you mean by that first sub bullet. If that is
Absolutely.
I started talking and then realized how nitpicky that might sound, but it's a reflection of how excellent the presentation seems to me to be, because it does seem to be a very new way of presenting what we have done the past 2 or 3 years. And I think we have to do a very new way this year because of where things are. So just mostly it's a big thank you, and just that 2 cents on a small thing.
No, absolutely. This is, as I like to say internally, we're in a very active iterative writing phase. So I'm happy to take that back and make sure that things are clear and on message.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please, Mr. Fye.
Just to go back to some of the comments you had on recommendation number 7, Renette, if you can jump to that one for a moment. When we're talking about the operating model, actually, we had a really good conversation at the Legislative and Policy Committee a little bit earlier this afternoon about what the federal role could potentially be. Looking at down the road, I think you're going to see that committee a little bit of engagement talking about that as well. How could the feds possibly play a role, direct, indirect, everything? There's some interest in some conversations, potentially from the Senate side. A couple other different folks that Kate's been really engaging closely with, but it is something you're going to see a little bit more talk about. So that's where some of the conversations between the two committees going forward this year might actually end up informing each other. But that conversation is out there on the legislative side as a federal priority going into next year.
That's fantastic, Alan. Thank you very much. I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised. So that's good. Thank you. Other comments, questions from committee members?
Mr. Chair, hi, Dave Snyder.
Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, sir. So since we're working on this slide, I'm a little bit concerned about an unintended message that there's a go-in willingness to look at more funding for Metro. I would rather go in with just the opposite assumption, that is, whatever we do, it's within the existing budget framework. I'm afraid that this language taken as is could potentially open the door, and I'm not really comfortable in doing that right now. I don't rule it out totally, but I think when you go back to the board's direction, for example, to the bus study, there was a lot about efficiency and business-like manner and way of operating. So to be more specific, I'm not comfortable implying that we're willing to go beyond the 3% cap that's been set. Now, I guess under the right circumstances with a huge amount of value, we could go back to our citizens and, make the case and let them direct us. But this one concerns me a little bit because I think some folks may take it as, well, the constraints are off. So I would appreciate some sort of comment about constrained, something like that. So that would be point number one.
And Mr. Snyder, could I jump in on that one before you get to point number two? Because I thank you for bringing that up. There are a couple things that are missing there. I think certainly the budget constraint is probably one, but what's also not there, I think, is one of the main reasons we've been talking about this is the limitations on our jurisdictions to pay more. The real estate tax, which finances most of our revenue in our jurisdictions, is really not able to withstand a lot more burden. And I think that's sort of an underlying assumption here is looking to see how we could move away from overburdening the real estate tax in the region for metro operations. I think somehow, and I've talked too long, but I think that idea needs to be captured, and Andrew, that's right.
Is. Absolutely. I can't remember exactly where, so I think we need to make sure that it is captured here, but either in the introduction or in other places, we've established that sort of the current framework moving forward is, unsustainable from multiple perspectives, both huge looming budget gaps, but also that can't be borne by our local jurisdictions who have limited tools in their fiscal toolbox, both long-term and short-term. And so that concept definitely is in various places, but I think we can make sure that it's embedded in this, the way that this group sort of proceeds.
And Mr. Snyder, let me jump in also. One other thing, the third bullet talks about reform, but I think we might want to be a little more specific based on your suggestion about a constrained budget. So basically, I think put something in there about reforms to achieve a constrained budget, something like that, that could be paired, or at least part of the overall analysis in the discussion.
Okay. The other question I had related to, and I don't know whether it's number 6, but the notion of metro, of local transit agencies taking over operation of metro bus services in Northern Virginia. Do our local bus services want to do that? In other words, what's the origin of that? I find it, and partly because in our situation, we're 100% metro bus. So I think that's unique in Northern Virginia. It's not my preference. I had a bus system going for a while and it got killed off during a financial crisis as a kind of a, I don't know, an example or whatever. But I think the big thing is what's the interest in doing that? If it's a legitimate interest, I'm fine, but I'm wondering about the origin of it. I mean, do the local systems really want to do that?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, and then Alan, if you want to add to it. I know at least for Fairfax County, we've been looking for several years at several years of increased subsidy and reduced service. And the disconnect is becoming wider and wider. And also, since in Fairfax County, the connector moves a lot more people than Metrobus, it really is, do we really need 2 totally separate systems, or is there a more efficient way of operating it? That's, at least I'll just, on Fairfax County's behalf, we are interested in exploring this.
Okay, and that's helpful because I wasn't aware of that interest before, so that's good to know. I guess one other thing, and I don't know if it necessarily needs to be here, but I really want a bus system that serves everybody, and that people that have options want to ride it as well, and that maybe they pay more than low income folks. I'm fine with that. But this should not be a system that just, exists as sort of a service to low income folks. I want that, but I also want a system that's so good, however it's operated, that people with choices also want to use it. And frankly, their fare revenue would help us fund the very best system that would serve everybody, including low income folks. So I don't know, that's just a thought I had. It doesn't necessarily have to be in here, but anyway, I thought that this is a good set of things to look at. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Snyder. I believe we have Mr. Letourneau on the phone. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've been on for a while. I was muted involuntarily, so I couldn't chime in. But I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. So I'm coming from our second strategic planning retreat that the Metro Board held, which was about 6 hours today. So we're about 11 hours into our strategic plan. I think that this report may look very different next year because it will have the benefit of that strategic plan being out, which is, I can say, very bold and directly addressing some of the things from Metro's perspective that we're talking about. Real quick on some of the specific points regarding the federal government and federal appropriations. One thing that we're sort of thinking about is obviously we all want to have some operating assistance from the federal government, but is there a way to approach that from the standpoint of safety and security as opposed to just a transit subsidy from a sort of emergency preparedness point of view? That's something that the general manager has been talking to the board about, and it may be something that we want to sort of couch our language a certain way, exploring different, opportunities for federal help rather than, just the broad sort of language we've had. And then on the bus situation. Obviously, we're going through the Better Bus Network Redesign process. I think that will sort of dictate how Northern Virginia as a whole wants to proceed and approach some of this. But I certainly, I think there's language that kind of reflects where we are, and the language that Walter was just talking about and Mr. Snyder was asking about is something that I have brought up as a board member, just to flag for the jurisdictions with bus service that we do have this inequity. The expenses, particularly on the capital side for bus, are going to really significantly increase in the near and longer term as we start getting into major capital projects around electrification and other things. And so if there is an inflection point where the region wants to have this discussion, it needs to happen quickly, because Metro is starting to get committed to major expenses that are shared by all three jurisdictions, even though right now they're mostly going into the district because those are the first depots that are getting worked on. So I just wanted to add some of those, maybe some detail on some of those things.
Matt, thank you as always. That's super helpful. Excellent information. I do see Ms. Mattice. Ms. Mattice has her hand up.
Thank you. I lost the signal for a little bit, so I appreciate coming back in. And I heard the comment about operating assistance first from you, Chair Alcorn, and then from Mr. Letourneau. Indeed, the conversation we had at our legislative committee was specifically expanded to be fairly broad in identifying opportunities for federal funding that at the federal level that could support WMATA operations. So I'm actually really excited to think creatively. As I think Alan passed along, we had some interest from the Senate side, but I know our House delegation was very concerned about talking about direct operating subsidies for transit. But I do think there may be some very interesting creative ways to approach that, not unlike we did decades ago with transit benefits, but I think different creativity. So that actually is really, really good to hear, because I think we're all sort of moving in the same direction. And I'd love to follow up to hear a little bit more about what Randy's thoughts are in that space.
Chair Alcorn?
Yes, Mr. Meyer. Mayor Meyer, go ahead.
We at our meeting earlier this afternoon, we also talked about two approaches. One is to press Congress for federal funding, because one model is that because Metro supports the operation of the federal government. This is the hub of the nation's national government, and people use the Metro to get to the Pentagon. People use the Metro to get to Congress, to the White House, key federal agencies from a national security perspective. It's kind of a variation on an old motif that generations of congressional delegations have used to provide funding for all kinds of projects in the DC area. The other model is to say, well, let's look at that all of the large urban metropolitan transit systems, whether it's LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Boston, Philly, and look, are there points of commonality in the operations of all of these systems that are, there could be slight variations between them, but areas where there could be a consensus among enough members of Congress to venture into the world of operational funding? Don't know. And then the question was, well, is there a national organization that could kind of oversee that and prioritize those areas of commonality? And are there certain categories of operational funding that might resonate, and whether it's improvements to energy consumption, or I'm just talking off the top of my head here, and that where the Congress could justify the investment by setting up matching funds kinds of arrangements. If you if you accept these federal monies, here are some guidelines to pursue X, Y, Z. I mean, this is very theoretical, very, very 20,000 foot level discussion, but that's another model. And whether we go the DC federal government, we need this for the good of the nation, or we're part of a nationwide urban transit initiative. I don't know. We didn't come to any conclusions. We simply sort of looked at both models. But I just thought I'd share that with you. We didn't come to any decisions or anything.
Mr. Meyer, thank you so much for sharing that. And I would just point out for the committee's benefit, I'm also hearing it discussed a little bit in the community. I was on Monday night a Dulles Regional Chamber of Commerce event, and this exact topic came up. And so, yeah, I think it's at least open for discussion, and I think some creative approaches could be very beneficial all the way around. So thank you.
You bet.
Other questions or comments from committee members on this topic? Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any hands up or unmuting. So let's move on then. We do have one more agenda item, and it's the Wamata FY 2024 budget outlook. And this is, I know, something the committee's been interested in, and the question of what the 2024 operating gap is going to be. And then the question about what are some of the structural and long-term operating budget and funding issues. We've been talking a little bit about it from a funding standpoint. But Wamata provided its board and the public with an update last week. And at this point, I don't know if this is a joint thing of Andrew, you and Mr. Letourneau, or how do you want to do this? Since
I think I will do the slides, and that way Mr. Letourneau can jump in seamlessly over the phone as needed, or can just jump in at the end.
All right, works for me. Take it away.
Still in the car on the way back from Petro headquarters, so
yeah,
I can't see the slides, but I've seen them before, and I will provide whatever color commentary and questions and analysis you all would like.
All right, Andrew, do the play-by-play.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, as the chair mentioned, this was presented to the Wamata Finance and Capital Committee last week. And we have a full rundown of all this in the meeting materials for next week's commission meeting as well. But I think the way that Metro staff started and presented this to the Finance Committee was a quick overview of the structural challenges to the operating budget that Wamata faces. I think this is something that Mr. Smedberg and Mr. Letourneau had sort of mentioned over the last 6 months. I think these are primarily split into sort of 3 buckets: the customer revenue structure, which really talks about the changing travel patterns, the changes to fare box recovery. The old model was primarily based on peak hour long distance fares, and that as that customer profile has changed post-pandemic, so is the revenue profile. Of course, increasing fare evasion fits into that as well. The second bucket is the cost structure, which I think we talked about inflation, and inflation as well is included in the collective bargaining agreements, and also that riders want good service. I think that's something we heard from Allison Davis previously, and that costs money to run. And then third, the subsidy structure, which again, it's on some themes from earlier. There currently are not dedicated revenues on the operating side, and there is a subsidy cap mandate on the operating side, as well as limits to how much subsidy can realistically be increased based on the ability of jurisdictions to pay and afford. Next slide. This slide shows essentially the new gap number is 187.4 million for fiscal 24. So that's good news. It's smaller than I think it was earlier this year. Management has put out a number of potential ways to close that gap. after looking at passenger revenue increases, non-passenger revenue increases, and expense reductions, that gets us down to 146.2, which is sort of what the board would deliberate on what their policy tools are to close that. So as presented by Metro staff, the three buckets are fare and service optimization. Obviously, increasing fare increase would generate more revenue. There is a policy discussion underway about simplifying fare structures. There's trade-offs in that. Service optimization, depending on how that goes, could result in expense savings. The biggest bucket here, I think, is increasing the preventive maintenance transfer, which is something that the committee has discussed in the past. And that would basically be to transfer more eligible PM expenses from operating to capital. There is a different capital funding picture now with both dedicated capital funding as well as additional revenue from the Infrastructure Act. And so this is the start of a conversation. And then Metro staff did present an option for increased subsidy, but I think that's not something that this committee is really interested in talking about at this time. I do want to be very clear that this is not a formal proposed budget. This is an early outlook and discussion with the board. The formal proposed budget would be in November. Next slide. And so I think just the key discussion topics for the commission and the committee to sort of deliberate on as more information becomes available is fare optimization. Some of those fare concepts, which we discussed last year, I think many of those back. Service optimization, bus network redesign is underway, so that's kind of handling bus, and then some of the rail optimization concepts for further discussion. And then what are those tools and what do we use to close the budget gap is, I think, going to be the biggest area of discussion. Next slide. This is our stylized version of Metro's fiscal cliff slide. And so what this shows is basically the long-term outlook between fiscal 23 and fiscal 29. And the assumptions in here are that jurisdictional subsidy is following the 3% subsidy cap. So you're seeing a gradual increase. Fair and non-fair revenues in this are at 75% recovery. Obviously, that future is uncertain. And then as federal aid is exhausted, expenses still rise, and the red is the gap. So fiscal 25, it's 738 million. Fiscal 29, that is projected to be 924 million. If ridership were at 100% of pre-pandemic, that gap would be smaller, but it would still be quite sizable. And so this links back to some of the prior conversations that Mr. Letourneau and Mr. Smedberg had that there were structural factors at play, and the pandemic accelerated. That these, we were on a more gradual course before, and basically everything got fast forwarded with the pandemic, and the aid obviously was there to plug the gap until it is exhausted. Next slide. And as far as next steps, again, this was the very early outlook. The formal budget proposal would be in November. The board will authorize public hearings in December. There would be a series of workshops, hearings, and then the Wamata board would approve the budget in March. As we have done in the past, this committee would meet either in December or January. We'll talk to the chair and figure that out. But we would meet in a timely fashion to review the budget, review comments, and forward them to the commission for some form of action. So TBD on the timing of that. So at this point, I'll pause if Mr. Letourneau wants to add any comments.
Yeah. Sure. So maybe going back a little bit to the discussion. So the gap, there's a slide there that should show the sort of the breakdown of the 187 million or so dollar gap. And the easy stuff is kind of accounted for there, which is the ridership, the growth. We're expecting more from joint development revenue from deals that are kind of already in the pipeline. There's some expense reductions, vacancy savings that are sort of baked in. The hard part is still the big number, which is about 145 or 6 million. We're looking at, the board has asked for detailed analysis about a simplified fare structure, looking at zone-based systems. I think, there's reasons to do that. However, I do want to caution that we're not going to get a lot of new revenue out of those type of fare changes. I think simplification would be a good thing for us. We have a very complicated system today. And there's, I think, a pretty solid agreement among board members that we want to look at that. An actual fare increase is certainly on the table, as every other sort of expense has gone up. So Metro has not raised fares in 5 years. Obviously, we'd like to be in a good service pattern by the time that we're having that discussion with the public, which, depending on what happens with 7000 series, we could be by then. But that's definitely on the table. And even that, that's not going to generate 146 million. The preventive maintenance transfer is something I'm sure that at first blush will give everybody a little bit of pause. I think the key discussion here is how much of our maintenance should be in the capital budget versus the operating budget. And the big takeaway is all of it is going towards maintenance, which is good. So it's not as if we're talking about diverting funding away from maintenance, but it's a question of which budget that it's in. There, staff presented some information about other agencies and sort of how they're accounting for this type of maintenance. There was, as Andrew said, a fairly sizable increase in what the federal government is giving us for our capital budget. So, I think there is room there to move some additional funding over from the operating side to the capital side and still be ahead of the game in terms of what we're putting in our capital budget. And then increasing car and subsidy is on here. Obviously, we're all aware of the 3% cap. The question is, if there's a budget gap over and above what we can really close without reducing service, it really becomes a question, I think, for the jurisdictions in terms of, do you want us to reduce service, reduce frequencies, or do you want to provide us more money? That's really what it's going to come down to. So, we're going to explore all those potential areas that we can grow revenue, like fares and simplifying the structure. But at the end of the day, we still might have to make some hard decisions. And then just going to the slide that shows the major funding gap, that's obviously the bigger concern. The hole that we have for FY25 is several times what this one is. And, if we're already kind of pulling all these levers to get down for 24, what is it going to look like when we get to 25? And that's really why I think the chairman has said before that the funding model is not sustainable. Metro, I think we're working on our goals, as I said, as part of our strategic plan. But, we understand that the jurisdictions aren't going to be able to come up with all this money. So it really will be time to start that conversation again, and not just start, but push the conversation about a funding model that's more aligned with how basically every other transit system is funded, rather than an annual appropriation from a whole series of governments that themselves are constrained. So why don't I stop there, and happy to have discussion and questions.
Yeah, Matt, thank you very much. That's very helpful. So let me see if I understand this right. So it looks like we still have maybe a little fiscal cliff for FY24, but the real cliff looks like it's now 25. Is that, am I right on that?
Yeah, I think, it's not going to be easy to close the 24 gap. And I think one of the things that I said last week was I'm a little concerned that we're, some of the tone of the Post story and things like that, we're sort of making it seem like 24 is not going to be a big deal. Right. Because, I think it's not going to be that easy to close that gap. But certainly, as an order of magnitude, the cliff in 25 and beyond is much worse and much more significant, and is not something we're going to be able to solve by, making changes around the edges.
Okay, I appreciate your take on that. Other committee members have questions or comments for Mr. Letourneau?
Chair, thanks. Matt,
Mr.
thanks a
Smith.
lot. And I know your other job is in the business world, different business, private business. So, I mean, this is, well, let me go back to one of the points you made a minute ago, that Metro needs to be funded the way other transit systems are funded. How are other transit systems funded?
With a dedicated revenue source, usually some sort of tax that automatically flows to the system.
Okay.
We have obvious challenges here with that type of approach because we have 3 different jurisdictions. But if you looked at New York City, for instance, it's or any other system actually, it's a automatic flow type of tax, basically.
I mean, is it a sales tax or an income tax?
Yeah, Andrew, jump in.
Yeah,
You've been working
this is
on
Andrew.
this.
If I can jump in, we're planning to bring our basically the findings of some work we did over the summer on exactly that question to the committee at its October 20 meeting. So just as to bring it back, we looked at a number of peer transit agencies, looked at their operating budgets, and it's a number of sales taxes, but a lot of other things. We'll working on bringing those findings in a few weeks.
Yeah. So let's go back, if I could, to the one that showed the different ways to close the gap for next fiscal year. Let's assume no increase in subsidy, because I think I would take an act of the legislature to do that, right? In the case of Virginia and Maryland, both actually. And I think one never wants to assume what the legislature will do. One hopes, and we've got good folks there, but you really can't assume that. So the increase in preventive maintenance transfer, tell me more about that, Matt. How much would that have to be? And then what's on the table in terms of fare and service optimization? Let's just, for the sake of this discussion, remove the increase in current subsidy.
Yeah, I mean, well, so then between those 2 buckets, we got to come up with 145 million.
Yeah, right.
I personally have I would have heartburn at a certain level of the preventive maintenance transfer increase. I don't have heartburn about increasing the amount of preventive maintenance, which I think is currently, Andrew, about 60 million, is it, in our capital budget? Is that right?
That's correct. And that is governed by board policy.
Yeah. So I would be open to going up to 80 or 100 million. I'm speaking only for myself. There were a variety of perspectives on this question amongst members of the board. So that's something we're going to have to hash out. We asked for some additional information about how other systems are handling that to understand what a best practice is. But I am very sensitive to the fact that in the past, there have been concerns about how Metro uses its capital funding. And, we have to be extra accountable about ensuring that it's actually going toward what it was dedicated to. So, exactly how much that number would be, I don't know. Let's just say for the sake of this discussion, it ends up being an extra 40 million to bring us up to 100, which reduces this number down to about 100. Fare optimization and service optimization. So it's going to be difficult to do much on bus because we've started the bus network redesign process. It will not be done in time for this fiscal year. And I think there's reluctance to really tinker too much with the bus network when we're already engaged in this process of trying to basically reimagine the whole network. That doesn't mean there won't be changes to it, but I think big changes are probably not in the cards. So then that leaves fare. I don't know yet. I mean, one of the board's follow-up questions is exactly when we push certain levers, what are those impacts? You know, there's always an impact when you increase fare. It could lead to declining ridership. And then, you know, you don't net as much as you think you're going to net. So there's analysis that the finance staff is doing around that. The board did give them permission to go off and do that analysis because of fare increases on the table. And then similarly with the actual fare optimization, I think there's a potential to net some additional revenue out of a new system. I can tell you, just again, putting this on the table, I am pushing for an elimination of the terminology peak fare. We can have two fares, but the peak fare is really a discounted fare. I mean, the non-peak fare is really a discounted fare. So, you know, we went to a flat fare on weekends and evenings already, and we're going to see what that kind of does for ridership and revenue. But for, you know, the rest of the time, I could see us, I'm just speaking hypothetically, so if anybody's listening, this isn't a Metro proposal, but we could go to that peak fare, for instance, as an average fare, and that becomes the daily fare all the time, other than when we're discounting nights and weekends. How much does that net? I mean, it will net something. It won't be, you know, probably the order of magnitude that we need. And so that leaves you then with your third bucket, which is going to be service reduction. And service reduction, you don't save much money unless you reduce headcount. Because most of that expense related to the service is, of course, the personnel cost. So we're going to be reluctant to reduce much headcount because in this workforce environment, it's very difficult just to keep your employees. And if we're able to work things out long term, we want to expand, then we're going to need those people back. So that's a real consideration there. But the money's going to have to come from somewhere. So, you know, it's I don't have the answers for exactly how it's going to work out yet, but you know, we're waiting for a lot of analysis from Metro staff that will help fill some of these knowledge gaps that we have. And what you're seeing is sort of an early look at what the board's considering without necessarily having all those answers yet.
Well, thank you, Matt. You're having a lot of fun on the board. Thank you. Matt, is there anything else you wanted to touch on today?
No, just that, you know, obviously this is a different process. You know, the Metro doesn't usually come out with this type of budget outlook in September. Usually the general manager presents a budget in November and it's pretty well baked. I think that's not really going to be the case this year. But one of the express purposes of coming out with this in this time frame is to solicit input from our jurisdictional partners. So, you know, and obviously the more constructive input, the better. We have a lot of input about things that folks would not like us to do, but, you know, are there other ideas or concepts out there that would help us reduce the budget cap? That's, you know, are there things that we're missing? You know, so we're open to all of that input, obviously. You know, when it comes down to having to make some tough decisions, well, certainly those will be done transparently and with a lot of discussion. You know, it's not been lost on the general manager that the state governments are running big surpluses. So it kind of speaks to the fact that, you know, where Metro is really constrained by its process. And, you know, the 3% cap has a lot of usefulness, especially when we start talking about labor costs and things like that. But, you know, almost nothing has gone up by 3%, obviously, in the last year or two. So it's really, it's a much more difficult constraint this year than it's been in the past.
All right. Matt, thank you very much. Any final questions or comments from committee members for Matt or Andrew on the FY 2024 budget outlook? Okay, Matt, thank you for participating by phone. Thank you for spending all day there working on that. Andrew, thank you for pulling this all together, and excellent presentation, and also excellent agenda tonight. Does anyone have any last items for the committee before we break? Okay, then let's go ahead. I'll adjourn the meeting as of 7:33. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.